You need to be more analytical, evaluative, critical. That was a common remark I used to get while I was in junior college, and I struggled to break free from those comments. But I learned throughout my journey in JC that really, being a critical, evaluative thinker is not as hard as it seems to be. By concretizing this abstract idea and applying some simple principles, I was able to think more deeply about different issues and content. I also found myself being more willing and desiring to understand more about the world around me. And in doing so, I was also able to break free from those comments. So let's get into it. What is critical thinking? Critical thinking is a broad skill and there's many different ideas that encapsulate it. But I'll focus on this definition for today. Critical thinking is the ability to think clearly and rationally, understanding the logical connections between ideas. So, this definition provides us two key concepts for critical thinking. Firstly, to think clearly and rationally. And secondly, to understand the logical connections between ideas. Right, let's look at the first idea, thinking clearly and rationally. Why is this so important? Without clarity in thought, one would never begin to be able to draw those connections between ideas, and as our ideas will not be consolidated. To think deeply about issues within a world that's increasingly more ambiguous and uncertain, the antidote is not certainty in thought, but rather clarity. So what? We need to practice thinking in an organized, in a structured manner. So that's why we need to be rational in our thoughts. As long as we are clear and rational in our thinking, our thoughts have the potential to be deeply insightful. Right. Let's go on to the second and more substantive part of the definition, the logical connections between ideas. Ideas in isolation of each other do not yield deep understanding. Why is that so? Deep understanding comes when one sees how different related ideas interact and explain each other. However, here's the problem. Our brains do not naturally draw these connections for us. Why? You see, our brains naturally default to this thing called shallow thinking. Shallow thinking is intuitive, automatic, and emotional. Bottom line, it's efficient. And our brains, particularly Singaporean ones, love to be efficient. Thus, it's the default mode of thinking and making sense of the world. However, this efficient mode of thinking is largely superficial. Why? Although it is fast, it only considers what is obvious and on the surface. It does not peel back the issue to see the logical connections beneath it. So what? How can we fix this problem? We need to move from shallow thinking towards deep thinking. So, what is deep thinking? Deep thinking considers a whole chain of effects, impacts, and outcomes. It's reflective and inquisitive, allowing us to consider the underlying issues within the given content. Albeit it is slower, but it's far more valuable and profoundly insightful. So, how do we do this thing called deep thinking? Well, it's very simple. All we need to do is conscientiously move to undertake this deliberate action of asking questions. But why ask questions? What are we accomplishing by doing that? When we ask questions, we force the brain to consider material critically and not superficially. We compel the brain to understand why claims are made, what are the core issues involved, and what are some possible effects and underlying causes. These questions help us to peel back the layers of the issue and think deeply about it. From going from question to question to question, our brain begins to draw out not only the different related ideas, but also the logical connections between them. So I might ask, what are some of these magical questions you can ask to promote critical thinking? Well, actually, they're very simple. In fact, you might have heard me use some of them just now. They are asking why and so what. So let me illustrate this with a personal anecdote. Okay, story time. Okay, a couple months ago, I was attached to Tuas Naval Base to serve out my prescription liability. For those who do not know, Tuas Naval Base is in the far west of Singapore, or basically no man's land, right? So one day, I was taking the MRT back, from Joo MRT, and I was looking out the window, and the train was moving from Joo to Pioneer. And I noticed something very interesting. There was a very sudden shift from industrial to residential land use. So I started wondering, why was that the case? Why was there such a jarring shift in such a short period of time? So I thought about it, and my mind drifted to ask myself to find this answer that it's probably because Singapore is a small nation and we have land constraints. So because we have a land constraint, there's a need to maximize the land space that we have. And thus, that might be a reason why we need to locate these different types of infrastructure in close proximity to each other. But then I wondered, how does Singapore do it? How do we allocate our land so efficiently? So I did a little bit of digging, and I found out this thing called the land use master plans that are done out by the Urban Redevelopment Authority. So basically, these land use master plans dictate the direction for land use for several years upon their enactment into use. So perusing through them, I noticed two interesting observations. I'll click through the different land use master plans that existed, and so you can take a look. First, we have 1958 and 1980. Then we have 2003 and 2008. And lastly, we have 2014 and the 2019 draft master plan. So, here are my observations. Firstly, they grew increasingly more complex, subdividing the land into more specific and a varied number of uses. Secondly, they also started to be revised at a much shorter interval. Ask myself, why were these observations as such? I looked at the position of Singapore within the international environment. The international environment is one that's increasingly being described as complex and volatile. Perhaps that's why there's a need for the subdivision of land into more varied uses to accommodate a more complex world. Also, need to keep revising them might stem from the idea that the world is increasingly volatile and constantly evolving. So, why is it that external developments in Singapore are so influential in our decision making? It's probably because of Singapore's depth of immersion into the international community. You notice, Singapore has very deep connections on the business, economic, strategic, diplomatic arenas, and that's just the start. This, along with our small size, leaves us particularly susceptible to volatility and ambiguity in the world. And thus, we need to be able to respond to it and stay ahead of the curve in doing so. But so what about this staying ahead of the curve? We may often hear it thrown around as a catchphrase. I thought about it too. And I realized that this staying ahead of the curve is very crucial for Singapore to stay relevant amidst all the change that's happening in the world. But why is relevance so crucial for us? Given Singapore's nature as a small state, one key for us to continue thriving has been this idea of relevance, and thus the emphasis on staying ahead of the curve, anticipating change and responding rather than reacting to it. In fact, it's even been enshrined in our Ministry of Foreign Affairs principles to approach international diplomacy. So what's all this effect on land use? Why is it so important? You see, focus areas for Singapore are largely influenced by these external developments and the desire to remain relevant. Thus, physical infrastructure needs to be dedicated towards these focus areas, and physical infrastructure requires land space to materialize. Thus, land use must be planned in tandem with such national objectives and prerogatives in order for land use to be maximized to continue to maintain Singapore's relevance. So we've seen that just by asking ourselves simple questions, why, so what, how, we unpacked the deeper issue behind why people might encounter difficulties with thinking critically about the world. We unpacked a solution around it, and also saw how this simple framework can be applied to help us understand our daily lives even better. I urge you, think critically about everything. It might just bring you new insights into the world around you. The more you do it, the more adept and more consistent you become at it. And you might just birth a new desire to inquire and understand more about the world that you are in. So, hope we no longer see critical thinking as this abstraction that is the reprieve of the intellectually gifted. Rather, hope we see it something as structured and approachable, simply requiring the intellectual curiosity to ask questions and wonder why anything is the way it is. For that is the power of why. Thank you.